Hello and welcome to another edition of Arirang News. It's good to have you with us. I'm Kwon Jang-wo. President Moon Jae-in has been in India for the last 4 days, renewing the diplomatic ties that the two nations have shared for the last 45 years. It has largely been hailed as a successful trip, especially when it comes to building relationships in trade and the economy. The trip comes amid various economic uncertainties around the world, including the escalating trade war between the US and China. The need for South Korea to diversify its trade partners is being keenly felt. We'll discuss that South Korea and India relationship in more detail with a guest in the studio later. But first, let's head over to our news centre, where Devin Whiting will update us with the latest headlines, including more details on President Moon's trip to India. Devin?
Right, Jang-ho. President Moon has now left India after that important summit in which he and Prime Minister Modi reviewed the entire spectrum of their country's bilateral ties and took them to a whole new level. Our chief Blue House correspondent Moon Gan-young filed this report from New Delhi.
$50 billion in bilateral trade by year 2030. That's a target the leaders of South Korea and India have set their eyes on as Asia's third and fourth largest economies vow to further expand economic cooperation. But trade is hardly the only area President Moon and Prime Minister Modi are determined to see improve in their bilateral ties.
인도의 글로벌 위상에 걸맞게 인도와의 관계를 한반도 주변 4대 강국 수준으로 격상시키려는 의도를 가지고 있습니다.
Drawing similarities between the two countries' foreign policy, the Indian Prime Minister pointed out that their two policies well align with one another.
I heartily welcome President Moon's belief that India-South Korea relation is a founding pillar of his new southern strategy.
오늘 모디 총리님과 나는 사람, 번영, 평화를 위한 협력을 정진하고 4차 산업혁명에 대응하여 미래 성장 동력을 함께 창출해 나가는.
To that end, the two leaders adopted a 17-point vision statement. In 4 big points, it eases visa processes to deepen cultural and people-to-people relations, sets a target of more than doubling trade volume and speedily concluding negotiations to upgrade SEPA. And peace.
Nuclear proliferation links in East and South Asia are also a concern for India. We will provide whatever help is needed in reducing tensions.
Finally, it vows to build a future together by joining forces to work towards Industrial Revolution 4.0. Now, having wrapped up one eventful first-day visit to the South Asian region, which ranged from paying tribute to Mahatma Gandhi and interacting with the average Indians on the metro, to opening the world's largest mobile manufacturing unit on the outskirts of New Delhi and taking South Korea-India ties to levels never seen before, South Korean President Moon Jae-in now travels to Singapore, the second and final leg of his 6-day South Asia and Southeast Asian tour. Traveling with the South Korean president, Moon Gan-young, Arirang News, New Delhi.
President Moon and Prime Minister Modi have agreed to pursue a massive boost in trade between their countries and to quickly finish negotiations on upgrading their free trade agreement, known as the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Our Cha Sang-mi has this report.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Tuesday agreed to open up their markets in key sectors, including India's agriculture and fisheries goods and Korea's petrochemicals, as well as promising to speed up progress on their Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. The two countries signed 7 MOUs on Tuesday, including establishing the Hwangok Memorial Park in India to commemorate the legendary princess of the Ayutthaya Kingdom in India who married a Korean king. South Korea and India will also increase cooperation in ICT and bioscience with Korea's National Research Council of Science and Technology and India's Council of Scientific and Industrial Research conducting joint studies. The two sides will also establish an Indian Rail Research Center and encourage cooperation between small and medium-sized companies. Korea's trade agency, KOTRA, also plans to strengthen its cooperation with India's Gujarat state. One expert says previous scientific cooperation has led to cooperation in industrial technology.
I would like to focus on the IoT market since the IoT market is growing rapidly in India.
it has been growing some 28% on average every year since 2016. The $5.6 billion IoT market in 2016 is expected to grow to $15 billion by 2020.
The expert says this will pave the way for Korean companies to enter the Indian market, where there are lots of startup companies that they can collaborate with. And the South Korean government's initiatives also seem a perfect match for the Indian government's foreign economic policy.
One of the hallmark of Modi's foreign policy is to welcome different countries, particularly different economic power, to come and be a process and part of India's developmental process. And I think in that context, Moon Jae-in visiting India is a very, very positive development, and it actually builds a context for India-South Korea cooperation.
Prime Minister Modi has laid out his Make in India, Clean India, or Digital India programs. And Dr. Panda says the government is looking for ways to make a stronger India through infrastructure development. Cha Sang-mi, Arirang News.
North Korea reacted negatively to the meeting last week with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, but the secretary has reaffirmed that Washington is committed to finding a peaceful solution to the current issues on the Korean Peninsula. According to the State Department Tuesday, that's what Pompeo said while answering questions in a meeting with American troops stationed in Kabul, Afghanistan. Meanwhile, President Trump has confirmed that he does indeed have a little gift for North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, a CD of the Elton John song Rocket Man. It had been reported that Trump and Kim discussed the singer and the song at their summit last month, and that Mike Pompeo was going to give Kim the CD when he went to Pyongyang. But Trump said Tuesday that he still has it, and it'll be given at a later time. And it looks like the trade war between the U.S. and China is escalating in a big way. The Trump administration has announced another round of tariffs on Chinese goods worth $200 billion. It's a figure far higher, actually, than the value of all the American goods China bought last year. As our Kim Mo-gun reports, Beijing said immediately that it plans to retaliate.
U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer on Tuesday released a list of additional Chinese goods worth some $200 billion that could be hit with tariffs of 10%. Lighthizer says President Trump ordered his office to begin the process in response to China's imposition of tit-for-tat tariffs of 25% on $34 billion worth of U.S. exports last week. China's most recent tariffs came a matter of hours after Trump announced that the U.S. was imposing its first round of 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of imports on Chinese goods. The U.S. Trade Representative criticized Beijing, saying its latest tariffs are, quote, retaliation against Washington and that they lack international legal basis or justification. The list of goods to face 10% punitive duties includes frozen meats, fresh fish and seafood, butter, onions, and a long list of chemicals. The latest announcement by the U.S. is expected to deal a big blow to Beijing, as these new tariffs would amount to nearly half of America's annual imports from Asia's largest economy. The USTR will begin a public notice and comment process prior to the imposition of the final tariffs, which could come into effect as early as September. In response to the news, China's Commerce Ministry announced on the same day that it cannot accept the additional tariffs proposed by the U.S., adding that it was shocked by the decision. The ministry also reiterated that China would be forced to hit back against the list put out by the U.S. Kim Mo-gun, Arirang News.
Last month, the South Korean economy added a little over 100,000 new jobs compared to a year earlier, the fewest since the financial crisis that started a decade ago. And it's far short of the government's goal in the coming years of adding annually upwards of 200,000 jobs. Won Jung-hwan reports.
The number of newly added jobs in South Korea remains in the 100,000 range for the fifth straight month in June, keeping the employment rate at 67%, unchanged from June 2017. Statistics Korea's job report released Wednesday also showed a decline in employment in the manufacturing education sectors. The figures for newly added jobs are the worst recorded since the financial crisis a decade ago, which saw 18 straight months from September 2008 to February 2010, where less than 100,000 new jobs were created per month. The unemployment rate went up 0.1% to 3.7%, while the youth jobless rate fell to 9%, down nearly 1.5% on year. Since May, The government has been using its $3.7 billion extra budget to try and create more jobs for young people amid concerns about the high levels of youth unemployment. The government aims to reduce youth unemployment to below 8% by 2021. 원정환, 아리랑 뉴스.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
President Moon completed his 4-day state visit to India on Wednesday. It has been largely considered a successful trip, building diplomatic and economic ties with one of the fastest growing economies in Asia. The timing is perhaps especially important as the traditional major economic powers continue to engage in trade wars, putting pressure on other nations to diversify their trade partners. Now, to further discuss President Moon's trip to India and some other stories of the day, we have with us Dr. Kim Chang-soo from the Korea Institute of Defense Analyses. Dr. Kim, thank you for coming back here to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you.
Now, during his trip to India, President Moon Jae-in has said relations with India was the most important outside of the four main partners, traditional partners that South Korea has, which are US, China, Russia, and Japan. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. Because India has been a very important partner of Korea for the last 34 years, because given the size of the growing size of the economy, Indian economy, because it's already a third, and in the PPP-wise, it's already third country. Let's go in nominal GDP again. India has achieved the 5th rank in the whole world. And by the 2030, it has made that India will become the third largest economy in the whole world. So given the growing potential of Indian economy, and also South Korea needs a kind of markets outside Korea, not just China or some other countries. India has become a very important market for Korea. But to be honest with you, there has been a lot of talks about this kind of growing economic trade cooperation between the two countries. But for the last 3 or 4 years, as a matter of fact, there has not been much progress as we expected. That's why Mr. Moon Jae-in went to New Delhi again, that really kind of stressed the growing importance, the potential of our bilateral economic and trade, because not only economy, but also security and military and defense ties. India has been a very important partner of South Korea, and also we are facing a kind of prosperity for making a peace on the peninsula, and also a lot of support from the outside world. India, again, will be a very important partner outside these 4 countries, just like Australia and Japan, United States, Russia. India will come next. So that's why Mr. Moon Jae-in put this tremendous stress on his visit this time, not only in economic and trade, but also security-wise. But for the sake of the people, I think the people is very important this time. People and prosperity and peace, 3 Ps and plus. This exactly, shows how important we see the potential of India in realizing all these kind of targets for the next couple of years. So we upgrade our relationship to a very special strategic partnership again, but also because we're going to face the Chinese and also North Korean threats, and also some kind of different forms, given the Panmunjom Declaration, because we declared we're going to put the end to the hostile policy between the 2 Koreas, and we need some outside assistance help. And in that sense, India, again, as they did in the past, will play a very important role. That's why we put a very renewed stress on our relationship with India this time.
You mentioned there, over the last 3-4 years, you say Korea had been talking about building more relationship with India, but they hadn't been making much progress. Why do you think that is?
That's a very complicated question, because actually Mr. Modi 4 or 5 years ago came up with a very good sounding initiative, beginning with the Make in India, Startup India, Digital India, all kind. He's a very brilliant kind of visionary, and that's why he has been very famous. He's very popular in India. Just like President Moon Jae-in, he came up with all good strategic narratives and making Korea again strong again. But again, Mr. Modi, also his strategy is make India again, first again. Just like Mr. Trump, America first, India first policy is Mr. Modi's trademark. So he is really ready to exert more influence, not only in trade and economy, but also security and also other countries. They really invite the outside to come to India and open their structures, infrastructure, building the structure in the first place, and make products in India and export these products from India. So this is a part of the FDI, foreign direct investment policy by the Indian government. But South Korea, we see a lot of commonality between our two allies. India has long been our very important partner, starting from the Korean War. But we are also talking about putting the end to the Korean War. So again, India will play a very important role, not only in the economy, again, our peace and security. The human factor is also important because given the all very strong economic ties for like Buddhists and also other some cultural ties, South Korea is pretty much have a lot of commonality with India. So that's why this time, the President Moon's visit is very important, not only in the economy, but I think we should more stress on our security as a whole, economic security, but also cultural and defense security as a whole. That's why India will continue to become a very important country. That's why we decide to regularize in a summit meeting every year.
Do you think there's perhaps more pressure now, especially with US and China, on all this kind of talks of trade wars with the US and Europe as well, that is pressure on South Korea and perhaps India to kind of diversify their trade partners as well, and to kind of diversify those kind of economic ties?
Exactly. That's why we have to diversify the markets, not only from Japan and United States, but to China, and then we're moving to India and some other Asian countries as well. Asian countries, for example, is like Singapore and some 9 other Asian countries are very important markets for us. It's not just the kind of making our benefits or profits maximum. It's a win-win strategy for these countries because ASEAN, also like India, are very important partners for our security as a whole, and also they have a lot of roles to play in stabilizing the Korean Peninsula with peace, just like Singapore did in the USDPRK summit meeting in June.
During his visit, President Moon also referred to India as a key partner for the new Southern policy that President Moon has been pushing for since he came to power. Can you explain to me briefly what the new Southern policy is and why it's important?
New Southern policy has a different name because under the previous governments as well, there has always a kind of policy that really stressed the importance of these powers, including India and Southeast Asia. Slightly different names, of course, but we put a renewed stress on India because for the last 3 or 4 years, India continued to grow very fast. They still maintain the growth rate like 7% annually. It's a very high rate given the size of Indian economy. So that's why we see a great potential in India and also the spiritual ideas and renovations. I think we found China and India as the most befitting partner in terms of the population, peace, and prosperity. That's why if you look at the declaration, that's the 3 words: for the sake of people, for the sake of prosperity and peace. So we have a lot of things to reinforce with each other, complement with each other in those 3 areas.
If South Korea pushes the new Southern policy, saying India is a key partner, India on the reverse says South Korea is a key partner for its Act East policy. What place does South Korea have in India's foreign policy, do you think?
Yeah, that's a very good question. If you look at we are talking about the Look East and Act Asia East policy, but originally it was a Look East Asia, Look East policy, and they changed it into Act East Asia. But also, if you have to remember, there's another policy as well, like a Learn West policy. There's a lot of other different names, but given our interest as South Korea, because South Korea is situated to the east of India, so that's why Act East policy. So Act East does not necessarily mean Korea. They include China and also Japan, and so any country east of India is a target of East Asia. Learn and Look East and Act East policy. So. Because given the size of the 3 economies in Japan and China, Korea, and they are very fast-growing economies, so quite naturally for the Indian government, Look East and Learn East and finally Act East is the culmination of their policy toward this part of the world, East Asia, particularly Northeast Asia.
Now he's completed his trip to India, and his next stop is Singapore. Before we move on, let's talk a little bit about Singapore. Like, what kind of relationship does South Korea and Singapore have? And what does Moon Jae-in want from this trip, do you think?
Singapore is the core country of ASEAN, even though it's a small in size, but it's a very important role to play among the 10 member ASEAN countries. And just like India, Singapore are the only countries that have both embassies with both diplomatic relations with North Korea and South Korea. They have the embassies in Singapore and in New Delhi. So they are really willing to play a very important constructive role, I should say, in bringing peace on the Korean Peninsula, and they're ready to do that. So we saw the importance of the Singapore, just like New Delhi, that they will play and they can and should play a very important role to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula, but also they can play a very important mediator role between China and United States, for example, because all these countries, India and Singapore, just like any other country, they have maintained a very good hedging strategy because they see two growing giants, United States and China. So how are we going to maintain the balance between these two giants? How are we going to, they're still away through these two giants as the core of their national strategy. And so that's why we have to learn a lot from India and Singapore as well. Because after all, we are doing all kind of our own hedging strategy between China and United States, even though there are some disputes about what that means. But anyway, all smaller countries, relatively smaller countries beside the United States and China, they definitely have their own hedging strategy. So I think these two countries, this time India and Singapore are the very important our partners in bringing peace on the peninsula and putting an end to the Korean War. So that's why Mr. Moon Jae-in has really stressed the importance of the two pillars of his new southern policy.
We have a few minutes left. Let's move on to the latest developments concerning North Korean issues. South Korea has confirmed that it will suspend its Ulchi exercise drills, military drills this year. That follows the suspension of the joint US military drills, the Ulchi Garden Freedom, and other military drills as well. Can you explain what these drills are and why they're important and what the suspension of the Ulchi drills means?
Because we have what we call the combined military exercise and training with the United States, but also we have our own independent military exercise and drill, mostly for some other purposes rather than North Korean provocation. If there is a natural disaster, for example, how are we going to manage all these mobilization of the forces, people and governments and the police, for example. So this is a typical Korean-only kind of training exercise. We'll continue to do that because it is very important as a country. But when it comes to combined military exercise and training, because it caused a tremendous alarm to North Korea, and Mr. Moon and Mr. Trump made it very clear we're going to consider stopping all these hostile activities toward North Korea, even though they are basically defensive in nature, but North Korea, and for that matter, China, have always claimed that these exercises are really hostile by Washington and Seoul. So as a gesture of talking some other alternative with peace and mediation, we decided to suspend, not canceling all these exercise and training for the moment, but temporarily sustain all these meetings. And this is a part of our CBMs, military CBMs, and we are looking for some kind of alternatives coming from North Korea. They should do some, accordingly, the same similar measures against South Korea.
Do you think this kind of gesture will actually convince North Korea, though, to take steps towards denuclearization?
Yeah, it would definitely help, because otherwise, if we don't have any visible outcomes or visible progress, they will not trust us. So this is a quid and pro quo between North and South Korea, and also United States and North Korea, because unless you give a very visible and kind of highly profile kind of gestures, particularly defense and military sides, and it'll be very difficult to persuade North Korean military, for example, that we should also consider stopping suspending all our military exercise by our side. Talking about North Korea. So this is again quid and pro quo, and this has been contained the spirit of the Panmunjom Declaration that both Koreas will work together to suspend all military exercises so that we can put an end to the long-held Korean War for the last 70 years and opening a new era of peace and prosperity between the two Koreas. So I think it's a very highly symbolic, but of course there are a lot of people particularly in the military, who are concerned about what kind of impact it will have on our military readiness, because if we don't repeat military exercise, the military readiness will definitely lower, so that's the concern. But I think we have to look at some other developments as well, because we're talking about the transferring of the Combined Forces Command CFC and UNC, because we're talking about new relation between US and DPRK. So it would definitely have an impact on our, for example, like Ocean Transport, CFC, UNC. So the military exercise and something is maybe a kind of preparation for our own self-sustaining, self-affordable military exercise, because if the UNC is gone or transformed, we have to come up with our own independent military exercise training. So this is a kind of preparation for that kind of period. If they might come anytime soon, if things really go well with North Korea. So this is a kind of preparations. And I think North Korea will also understand the United States is really pretty much watchful about each and every step North Korea will do in response to our cancellation, or not cancellation, but suspension of all these military exercises and training.
I guess it is a card to lower military tensions.
Sure.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you for coming in today and sharing with us your insights.
My pleasure. Okay.
That concludes our show. Hope you can join us next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to Arirang for our later newscasts for the latest news updates. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.